In rare and brutal bear attacks, the ferocity of these encounters can be horrifying. In some cases, bears, driven by instinctual aggression or territorial defense, can inflict unimaginable harm on their victims. Reports have suggested instances where these formidable creatures have grievously wounded their prey, including being skinned alive. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. In today's episode, we take a look at 3 times people have had their skin peeled off during a bear attack. Welcome to Final Affliction. October 22, 2019, Alexey Ivanovsky was a soldier in the Russian army. He was taking a break from his duties when he and his friends headed out for the afternoon to collect crabs. Their destination was the shores of Kunshur Island, off Russia's east coast. Deciduous trees mix with spruce, pine, and fir forests, giving all-year cover at the foot of the volcanic mountains. The shorelines are rocky with jagged outcrops and steep cliffs. It is home to a number of rare bird species, as well as brown bears. Tourists make their way there by boat or plane. They take guided tours to see the 4 active volcanoes situated on the island and the fascinating geological formations. In October, the bears are getting ready to hibernate. They are eating huge quantities of food in an attempt to fatten up for the long, harsh winter months. They need to eat upwards of 90 pounds or 40 kilograms a day. Bears in October are hungry. For this reason, tourists are advised to take guided tours only. When Alexey and his friends headed down to the rocky shore, they split up to find crabs for their dinner, each with a bucket in hand. They scanned the shoreline and the shallows for the edible specimens. Once Alexey got his eye in, he was catching multiple crabs to fill his bucket. But the group of friends weren't the only ones searching for food on Kunshur's shores. They were so busy eyeing crabs that they didn't spot a brown bear and her cubs emerge from the tree line. She had heard the friends chatting, she had smelt their presence, and she had homed in on their location. She was fast approaching them, stalking them silently. Alexey continued to crouch down, dipping his hand into the shallows. He hovered over each unsuspecting crab before rapidly thrusting his hand downwards and ripping it out of the water. Then, suddenly, one of his friends yelled out to them, "Bear!" Alexey looked up. Less than 50 yards away, a mother bear was walking towards him. Her eyes were fixed on his. Her head was tilted downward slightly. Her ears were pricked up. She lumbered across the rocky shore, each powerful paw spring-like as she came closer and closer to Alexey. Behind her were 2 cubs, following closely. Although she looked thin, she stood 4 foot at the shoulder, and she probably weighed in excess of 150 kilograms or 330 pounds. Alexey let go of his bucket. It clattered to the ground. He stood up. Terror seized him. He held his breath, hoping that she would turn away, hoping that she would bluff. But this was not a defensive approach. This was predatory. The bear was looking for a meal, and she had found it. Alexey knew not to run. There was nowhere to run anyway. Behind him were the rock pools leading to the open ocean. In front of him, the hungriest predator on the island. Before anyone could do anything, the bear launched itself at Alexey from several yards away. It sprung at him, knocking him to the ground. He fell face down onto the rocks. He felt the incredible weight of the bear on top of him. He felt the searing pain as the bear slashed his body and punctured his skull. He gasped for air as he pushed his face into the ground. He tried to cover the back of his neck with his hands, but the bear's attack was so rapid and forceful that Alexey could barely think straight. With an agonizing rip, the bear grabbed his scalp in her jaws and savagely pulled. Something had to give. The bear pulled so hard that Alexey's skin peeled back over his head, exposing red, raw flesh. His friends screamed in horror and ran over to him. They picked up rocks and stones, flinging them at the bear. But with their shouts and screams, the bear seemed to become more and more frenzied in its attack. It shook its head viciously, thrashing Alexey's trembling body in its powerful jaws. The female bear momentarily let go of her prey, only to clamp around his legs and pull him away. Alexey was being dragged from the shore and towards the tree line. His friends followed. They continued to pelt the bear with all that they could find, but the bear didn't even flinch. With every attempt at rescuing their friend and scaring away the bear, the attacks seemed to become more aggressive. The bear wanted to subdue its prey quickly. It wanted to eat its kill in peace, and the presence of the group of friends was making that difficult. She bit into Alexey's neck, and he let out an ear-piercing scream. She began once more to peel the skin back off Alexey's body, ripping and tearing it all the way down his neck and shoulders. Next, the bear grabbed Alexey's buttocks, tearing the flesh from bone. He was still alive. He was still fighting to stay alive. All he could do was persistently force himself face down into the ground. The bear kept trying to roll him over. She was trying to get his soft underbelly, trying to expose his more vulnerable side. Alexey just kept breathing. He tensed every muscle in his body. The agony of the attack began taking over, and he felt he couldn't hold on anymore. But he was trying. He was desperately trying. It was agonizing for his friends, too. They stood only yards away from the bear, but felt helpless. Nothing they seemed to do deterred the bear. She was focused and determined. In desperation to save him, Alexey's friend, Alexander, rushed at the bear. He kicked it and tried to push it away. The bear briefly turned on him. In a moment of terror, it paused and looked up at Alexander, its dripping jowls gaping. It slashed Alexander with its huge claws and he fell backwards. But instead of launching a new attack, the bear turned back to continue devouring Alexey. Whilst the group quickly grabbed the injured Alexander and pulled him out of the way, another of the friends rushed over to their car. He jumped into the driver's seat and frantically turned the key. The engine roared into life and he slammed his foot down on the accelerator. He drove at the bear, revving the engine, flashing the headlights and honking the horn. He couldn't hit the bear with the car because she was straddling Alexey, but he continued trying to scare the bear. Again and again, he rammed the car forwards. At first, she didn't move. She continued to try and drag her prey away. Her cubs hesitated a few feet behind her. Then eventually, the three of them gave up and ran off into the trees. Alexey's friends ran over to him. He was in a mess. His exposed flesh was oozing blood. His boots had been ripped off. The bite in his buttocks was bleeding profusely. His friends applied pressure and talked to him. They willed him to stay awake, willing him to survive. They immediately called the emergency services and waited anxiously until, to their relief, they heard the distinctive sound of a helicopter. It landed a short distance away, and the medical team rushed over to the attack site. As they were loading his bloodied body up into the chopper, Alexey closed his eyes and his heart stopped beating. Immediately, the paramedics began CPR, and miraculously, Alexey's heart began beating again, but he remained unconscious. He didn't respond to his friends' cries or to the emergency crew. He was flown 250 miles to the regional capital, Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk, where surgeons immediately began patching him up. His ear was sewn back on. The gaping wounds and torn skin were stitched back together. He was pumped full of antibiotics to keep infection at bay, but they couldn't save his leg. It had been bitten so badly that the surgeons had to amputate it. Alexey was left in a coma. He received around-the-clock medical care and survived for more than a week. His friends were hoping and praying for his recovery, but sadly, his heart gave out and he passed away 9 days after the attack. He was just 36 years old and left behind his wife and 2 children. Bear attacks are relatively common in Russia. There are approximately 120,000 bears in Russia, and reports suggest that over a 25-year period, there were more than 260 bear attacks. As humans encroach more and more on bear habitat, there are greater chances of bear encounters. Whether these are predatory or defensive attacks, the outcome is rarely a good one for the person involved, often resulting in their untimely final affliction. Karma is a crazy concept, but one that is widely believed to keep the natural balance. It is the idea that if you do good things, then good things will come to you. Likewise with doing bad things. We like to think that if we are good people, then we will be saved from negative energies around us, as it should only be reserved for those who intentionally commit bad behaviors. But what if this isn't the way the world works? What if every action is simply random and has no consequences on the outcome of a situation? These ramblings are probably close to what Wes Perkins was thinking in May of 2011, as a large grizzly bear ripped his face off in between his screams for help. Alaska's Seward Peninsula is on many people's bucket lists, with beautiful glacier hikes, the historic Iditarod Trail, and even the opportunity for whale watching activities. Despite its appeal, visitors need to be constantly aware of their surroundings, as there are countless dangers in this icy wilderness. With most Arctic environments, the grizzly bear is able to thrive with its thick fur and expert hunting ability, which, in an area with an incredible diversity of fish and fauna, the grizzly bear is clearly the top predator. Despite this, these bears are particularly vulnerable in the spring as they are just emerging from hibernation. These animals will usually be in quite poor shape as they haven't eaten for months and might even have newborn young with them. They are weaker than usual and so are easier prey for humans. People have realized this, and so there is an annual tradition of spring bear hunts. This is where Wes Perkins becomes involved. In May 2011, Wes and two hunting buddies, Dan and Edward Stang, arrived in Seward Peninsula ready to hunt some bears together. They were avid outdoorsmen and regularly organized trips together to escape from the noise of their towns. A few days into their trip, they found the tracks of a large male bear and began to follow them into the snow using their snowmobiles. They could tell from the paw prints that this animal was an incredible size and would be the talk of the town if they were able to hunt and kill it. Suddenly, the tracks disappeared. Wes got off of the vehicle and searched the ground for any sign of the bear. Little did he know, the bear was watching him from 70 feet away and was just waiting for the perfect moment to strike, the moment that the hunter would become the hunted. The bear suddenly pounced, launching himself through the trees and straight towards Wes. Hearing the rustle behind him, Wes turned and was horrified to see the huge male bear rushing towards him with murder in his eyes. He tried to grab for his rifle, for anything that he could use in defense, but the bear was too fast. Instead of the weak and vulnerable bears they were expecting, this animal was in the prime of his health and ravenous from a long hibernation, about hungry enough to eat a human if he could get his paws on one. He knocked Wes to the ground as his massive frame smashed into him at 50 kilometers per hour and, in one swift movement, grabbed onto Wes's face. His head was dwarfed in comparison to this massive predator, and as he stared at the rows of teeth in front of his eyes, he knew that his chance of survival was very low from this point onwards. Almost immediately, the bear began to shake Wes like a dog would with a new toy, using all of his skills to try and kill his prey. As he shook, his teeth sank deeper into Wes's face, and he could hear his own skull cracking under the pressure that this animal was able to put him under. He bit more and more, harder and harder, trying to completely break his skull and end the whole ordeal. He forced his body into the ground and began to claw away at his body in an attempt to shred him into pieces. Wes felt that he didn't have long left. His pain was fading away and replaced with adrenaline that he knew he had no energy to even use. Pieces of skin and bone were being flung from his body as the animal viciously tried to kill him. When his two friends finally arrived to the scene and saw the horrific scene, not knowing if he was alive or not, they shot the bear quickly and from a safe distance. The bear let go of Wes while letting out a growl of pain before running into the safety of the forest. Once the men were sure that the bear had fled, they immediately attended to their friend, but they were horrified by what they saw. Wes's bone structure in his face was completely destroyed, with a terrifying array of bite marks and missing bone fragments strewn across his whole body. He was completely unrecognizable, and the majority of his face was hanging by loose strands of skin. He was missing his nose, his jaw had been ripped from his face, and, at this point, he was completely blind, clawing at his airways in an attempt to breathe. The father and son began to try and save his life, knowing that they would only have a short amount of time before Wes would become unresponsive, either from passing out from the pain or succumbing to his injuries. They questioned him to try and find out any information from the attack that may help him, but with no jaw, he was finding it impossible to respond to anything. He began to use hand signals instead, the only way that Wes would be able to communicate for a very long time after the attack. They radioed to Nome, the nearest town, informing the rangers of the situation and begging them for help. After hearing about the intensity of the attack and the condition of Wes, helicopters were dispatched in minutes, flying to the scene in an attempt to save Wes while they had the chance. While they were waiting, Wes drifted in and out of consciousness as the blood loss from the attack began to take effect. Once he was recovered into the rescue helicopter, he was immediately flown to Harborview Hospital, where he immediately was placed into a coma. He spent 5 days in this coma and underwent 26 life-saving surgeries, totaling over $1 million in medical bills. His face was completely reconstructed with titanium, replaced parts of his jaw where the bear had ripped it clean off, and he was unable to speak or eat independently for many months to come. He was unable to eat any solid food, so everything had to be fed to him from a blender, and his sight was barely salvageable, reduced to only light and dark. He was left with just half a tongue, something that the doctors were not able to rectify. And while he is now able to talk, it's heartbreaking for a man who loved to talk as much as he did, having to suffer these life-changing disabilities. Once he was finally released from hospital, many months later, he then struggled with a methadone addiction due to the high pain that his injuries caused. He was unable to live life without the help of this drug, dulling the pain for hours on end, just for it to return with the same brutality as the day the attack happened. Luckily, with the support of his friends, family, and medical professionals, Wes was able to recover once again. The recovery process was long, painstakingly long, and there were times when Wes believed it would be easier to just die and escape the pain and horror of his ordeal. But he lived on. Despite the ferocity of the bear, the remoteness of the scene, and the horrific injuries that he sustained, Wes Perkins survived one of the worst bear attacks in history. Despite his ordeal, he says that he has no ill feelings towards bears, stating that they are neither good or bad, just wild animals, and people need to be careful around them. Wild animals will behave like wild animals. They are unpredictable and dangerous, but as long as you stay aware of your surroundings, then you should be able to survive. He is no longer able to hunt as he once did, but states that those who can should stay alert to stay alive and avoid the same fate as his own, having your face savagely bitten off by a bear and possibly meeting your final affliction.
With its rich agricultural history, the city of Chateau in Montana evokes striking images of a green landscape with a variety of wildlife. It is home to some of the world's most elegant species in the animal kingdom. Mule deers, wolves, badgers, squirrels, moose, elks, and bears, both black and grizzly, all coexist in this biota. This automatically makes Chateau a great venery ground for game hunting, and so it is no surprise that on October 3, 2015, 26-year-old Chase Dellwo and his brother, 30-year-old Shane, decided to head west to Bynum to bow hunt elk. Having been brought up on a family ranch in Blackleaf, the two brothers were experienced big game hunters who used bows as their preferred weapon. It was a chilled Saturday morning, and the clocks were striking 8. Being October, Chateau was immersed in intense cloud cover with temperatures going as low as 7. The vile wind was full of snow, with each exhalation leaving a condensed cloud of air. This limited their vision to as far as only 5 meters of their surroundings. But the thought of hot, sumptuous elk steak that the brothers would eat to the marrow of the last bone was enough motivation for them to face the harsh weather. Their limited visibility meant that hunting by stealth was going to be a huge challenge, and so the pair hatched a plan. They geared up and decided to split. Shane, the older brother, was going to scale up a ridge and wait while Chase was to drive the elk herd towards a creek bed. The ridge Shane had climbed provided a clear aerial view of the creek bed where he would size one of the elks before taking it down. They had devised the perfect plan, free of any flaws, or so they thought. As Chase was meandering the creek bed, the heavens suddenly opened and the rain started pouring. Just like a musical chime, it began as tapping as a drop hit his shoulders, but it soon developed to a rattling pitter-patter with more drops pouring. With the snow, misty air, and now rain, the weather was worsening with every step he took. He wondered if it would be a successful hunt given the shortcomings. Suddenly, a loud bugle, followed by a chuckle at the end, cut him short on his thoughts. He knew that sound, having gotten used to it during his many hunting escapades. It was a bull elk. Judging by the origin of the sound, the elk was nearby. Vainly, his fiend mind struggled to comprehend the direction of the source of the bugle. The creek was covered with rich, soft grass that was beginning to get buried beneath the falling snow. To the north and east of him was the wonderful panorama of the rocky ridges and mountains partially covered in snow. And on one of those ridges was his brother patiently waiting to strike. Armed with his bow, Chase focused all his senses on finding the elk. Nothing in the world was going to stop him from completing this mission, not even the droning music of running water from the nearby streams that were about to freeze because of the cold. But before he could go further, an eerie feeling that he was being watched stopped him in his tracks. Motionless, Chase sniffed the wind. The air here changed. It smelt different. A scent had come to his nostrils, one he had not smelt in a long time. It stirred him strangely. If only he had been able to see distinctly for just 1 mile, his eyes would have discovered it. He reared up 3 steps behind, as if trying to slowly rest his haunches and sit like a trained dog with his bow raised to level his face, ready to release the arrow. But before he could, the bear leaped, attacking him as if it had been waiting for this moment all its life. This sent him to the ground with a thud. The grizzly bear was huge. On its hind legs, it was taller than any human, with its feet planted firmly on the wet, muddy ground. With its shaggy, thick brown fur, it seemed to bear the mysteries of nature with it. The bear then opened its huge mouth, grumbled, and then sank its 3-inch fangs into Chase's left eye and skull, completely catching him by surprise. As it is with nature, the hunter sometimes becomes the hunted. Having grown up on a family ranch, bear encounters were not alien to him, as he had been charged by lone bears not once or twice. However, even with this rich, expansive background, he had been unable to avoid this nose-to-nose encounter with a grizzly bear. If only the weather was a bit more welcoming, Chase would have seen the bear from afar and avoided it. For a moment, the bear stopped attacking. Chase was silent and immobile. Bleeding and seriously injured, he felt helpless. He knew that death was within and knocking. But the ordeal was far from over. The tenacious beast pinned him down with its clawed paws and once again let out a thundering roar as if announcing its dominance. It then took a step back, an opportunity that Chase used to sit up. But this turned out to be a mistake, as the bear came at him again, this time round biting him on his leg and shaking him bitterly before throwing him up into the air. He came thudding down, but the bear was not done yet, as it went straight for his head. The picture of his beautiful wife Becca back at home waiting for him, And his brother high up on the ridge crossed before Chase, and he knew that he had met his fate on this mushy creek with a splatter of soft mud and snow. It was during this short flashback that his memory came to his aid as he remembered an article that his grandmother had once shown him on how animals, especially bears, have sensitive bad gag reflexes on their soft palates. With great courage, he mastered the little strength left in him and with all his might shoved his right arm into the bear's throat. Perplexed and confused, the bear disappeared into the snow while gagging uncomfortably. Chase knew that it wouldn't take long before the bear came back to finish him off, or even worse, he would bleed to death. He had to move. His camouflage hunting gear had been torn to tatters and he was covered in blood and mud. With his palms, he wiped the blood off his eyes. He chose flight over flight and dawdled through the creek bed's terrain towards the direction of the ridge he had seen his brother take. From the ridge, Shane saw his brother waving and thought that the cavalry was finally here. He positioned himself with his bow and arrow, ready to take the shot of his life. However, after taking a second look at his younger sibling, this time with more of a degree of acuity, Shane realized the dire state of his brother. He immediately dashed down to him and administered first aid. He stopped the bleeding but was worried about the possibility of internal bleeding and had to rush Chase to the hospital. He hurriedly carried Chase to the car, gunned the engine, and pressed his foot hard on the gas pedal. The engine revved and the tires screeched as the rubber came to contact with the tarmac. Leaving a cloud of smoke behind, the air was filled with the smell of burnt diesel and rubber. Within seconds, the speed gauge was jerked a little over 100 miles per hour. The 20-minute drive felt like an eternity as Chase seemed to lose a decade with each breath. Luckily, there were only a few cars on the road, and within no time, they saw a big blue and white hospital sign. They were now at the emergency wing of the Benefice Teton Medical Center in Choteau. Fortunately, they arrived just in time to save his life. After a 5.5 hours long surgery, Chase's face was covered in hundreds of stitches. And when asked for his advice to anyone who wants to go hunting, he said that they should never go alone. And he is right. Don't go hunting alone in rainy, misty weather. Try as much as possible to live in agreement with nature. After all, if you respect it, it will always reward you. If you don't, you may end up meeting your final affliction.